The sharp screech of microphone feedback cut through the laughter like a knife, freezing the guests in the Bennett ballroom. Amara stood near the tall windows, her burgundy velvet gown catching the light of 100 chandeliers. She had chosen this dress so carefully, hoping her family would finally see her as more than just a shadow. But as her father gripped the microphone, his face was cold and hard. A Bennett must contribute to the family legacy, his voice boomed, echoing against the high ceilings. He didn't look at her with love. He looked at her like a business deal that had gone wrong. Since you choose to be a burden and refuse to follow our rules, you are no longer a Bennett. From this moment on, you are a stranger to this house. A heavy silence fell over the room. Amara felt the blood drain from her face as her mother and siblings turned their backs, refusing to meet her eyes. They had stayed silent while she was publicly disowned in front of the city's most powerful people. "Someone show this stranger to the door," her father commanded, his voice flat and final. Security guards stepped forward, their heavy boots loud on the marble floor. Amara kept her spine straight and her chin high, even as her heart felt like it was breaking into pieces. She walked past the guests who were whispering behind their hands, past the family that had just erased her, and toward the heavy oak doors. She pushed the doors open and stepped out into the dark night. Within seconds, the cold November rain soaked through her velvet dress, making it heavy and dark. Her long curls flattened against her neck as the storm took hold. Behind her, the doors slammed shut, locking her out of the only world she had ever known. She stood alone on the stone path with nowhere to go and no one coming for her. Or so they thought. They had no idea that the man they feared most was already watching from the shadows. As the cold rain soaked into her skin, Amara closed her eyes and saw her past flashing before her like a sad movie. For years, she had been nothing more than a living doll for the Bennett family. She remembered her 10th birthday, not for the cake or the presents, but for the way her mother had gripped her arm. Her mother had forced her into a stiff lace dress that made her skin itch just so she could stand still in a family photo. "Smile, Amara," her mother had whispered, her voice like ice. "Don't let them see you are unhappy. You are a Bennett, and you must look perfect." She was always used as a prop to help her father's business. At dinner parties, she was told exactly what to say and when to laugh. Her parents didn't care about her dreams or her feelings. They only cared about the Bennett brand. They used her graceful appearance to show the world how successful and refined they were. She was an ornament, something to be put on a shelf and admired from a distance but never actually heard. But as Amara grew older, she began to have her own thoughts. She started to say no to the corrupt deals her father tried to make using her name. She refused to be a pawn in their games. That was when her family decided she was too much. The same people who once bragged about her beauty started calling her a burden. They began to ignore her at the table, leaving her seat at the end of the long hall like she was already gone. The invisible daughter had finally become visible by standing up for herself, and they hated her for it. Standing now in the storm, Amara realized they had never really seen her at all. They only saw what she could do for them. Her loyalty had kept her tied to them for far too long, hoping for a love that was never real. As the water ran down her face, it felt like the heavy weight of her family's expectations was finally washing away, even if the loss felt like a wound in her chest. Before the screaming began and the doors were locked, Amara had spent hours preparing for the night. She stood in front of her mirror, touching the soft, burgundy velvet of her gown. The fabric felt rich and heavy under her fingers, and she had chosen this specific wine color because it made her feel strong and polished. She wanted to look her very best, hoping that if she looked perfect enough, her family might finally treat her with respect. This dress was her sacrifice, a way of showing them she was still a loyal Bennett who deserved to be there. She carefully brushed her long, dark curls until they fell perfectly over her shoulders. Every clip and every pin was placed with a shaking hand because she was nervous. In her mind, she kept telling herself that tonight would be different. She imagined her father smiling at her or her mother giving her a kind word instead of a cold command. She truly believed that if she played her part one last time, the invisible wall between her and her parents would finally crumble. Amara took a deep breath and straightened her back, looking at the elegant woman in the mirror. She felt like a queen ready for her throne, not knowing she was actually dressing for her own public rejection. She had put so much hope into the velvet and the lace, thinking clothes could change a heart made of stone. With a final look, she picked up her clutch and headed toward the ballroom, walking toward a trap she had set for herself with nothing but love and a dream of belonging. The walk to the door was the longest walk of Amara's life. As the security guards stepped closer, their heavy boots made a loud, scary sound on the smooth marble floor. Amara did not let her head hang low. She kept her back straight and her chin high, even though her heart was breaking into pieces. She refused to give the crowd the satisfaction of seeing her cry. As she moved through the ballroom, she had to pass her siblings. They stood together in their expensive silk suits and sparkling dresses, looking like a wall of ice. Her brother did not look away in shame. Instead, he watched her with a mean smirk on his face, as if he was happy to see her fail. Her sisters did not reach out to help her. They whispered behind their hands and laughed quietly, enjoying the fact that she was being thrown out like trash. To them, Amara was just a problem that had finally been solved. They had always seen her as a threat to their perfect image, and now she was finally gone. Their cold eyes followed her every move, watching for any sign that she might stumble or beg for mercy. But Amara did not stumble. Every step she took was steady and firm. She walked past the people who were supposed to love her, feeling the heat of their hatred on her skin. When she finally reached the giant oak doors, the guards did not hesitate. They pushed the doors open, and the freezing night air rushed in to meet her. Amara took one last look at the room full of light and gold, and then she stepped out into the dark. The doors slammed shut behind her with a heavy thud that echoed through the night. She was officially on the outside, standing on the wet stone path while the rain began to fall. She was alone, but for the first time in a long time, she was also free from their cruel games. The sky seemed to open up, pouring down a heavy, freezing rain that felt like the world was crying with her. Amara stood perfectly still on the stone path, her body shaking from the sudden cold. Within seconds, the rich burgundy velvet of her gown was completely soaked. The dress that had made her feel like a queen just an hour ago now felt heavy and ruined, clinging to her skin in a way that made her feel small and exposed. The water ran in thin rivers down her arms and shoulders, washing away the warmth of the ballroom. Her long, dark curls, which she had brushed so carefully, were now flat and wet, dripping onto her back. She looked down at her hands and saw they were trembling, not just from the wind, but from the shock of being discarded by her own blood. She felt wounded, like a bird with a broken wing, standing in the middle of a storm with no shelter in sight. She did not reach for her phone to call for help, and she did not try to bang on the locked doors. She just stood there, letting the raindrops mix with the silent tears on her face. To anyone watching from the windows, she looked like a broken doll left out in the yard. The Bennett brand was gone, and all that was left was a young woman with wet hair and a soaked dress, trying to breathe through the pain in her chest. Every breath felt sharp and cold in her lungs. She looked out at the long, dark driveway, seeing nothing but shadows and the gray light of the storm. She felt entirely alone, like she had been erased from the world. But even in her sadness, she kept her chin level. She was vulnerable and cold, but she was still standing. She didn't know that the darkness at the end of the road was about to move, or that the most powerful man in the city was already coming to claim what her family had thrown away. The silence of the night was broken by a deep, low sound that rumbled through the ground like rolling thunder. Amara lifted her head, her wet curls dripping as she squinted through the heavy rain. At the far end of the driveway, two bright lights appeared through the fog. They moved slowly, like a giant beast waking up in the dark. Then, more lights appeared behind the first set, cutting through the gray storm with sharp, white beams. The sound grew louder as the heavy tires rolled over the wet stone path. It was a steady, powerful noise that made the air feel different. 5 large black SUVs drove toward the mansion in a perfect line. They didn't rush, and they didn't slow down for the puddles. They moved with a kind of strength that showed they owned the road and everything on it. The light from their headlights caught the falling rain, making the driveway look like it was covered in sparkling silver. Amara stood perfectly still, her soaked burgundy dress clinging to her as she watched the vehicles approach. The SUVs began to fan out, moving in a practiced way until they formed a half circle around her. It was a silent, grand arrival that felt much bigger than a simple car ride. The engines made a soft, even hum that seemed to push back the sound of the wind. Through the windows of the mansion, she knew her family was watching. They would be confused, wondering who would dare to arrive at their home with such a loud and bold display of power. The black paint of the cars was slick and shiny from the water, looking like armor under the estate lights. Everything was still for a heartbeat as the lead vehicle stopped right in front of her. The heavy door began to open, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The rolling thunder had stopped, and something even more intense was about to begin. The door of the middle SUV opened, and Lee Min-jae stepped out into the pouring rain. He was not wearing a heavy coat to protect himself from the storm. Instead, he wore a white, long-sleeved dress shirt that the rain soaked through almost instantly, making it cling to his strong build. As he moved toward Amara, the water pressed his dark hair close to his head, showing off his sharp jawline and the serious, restrained look on his face. The most striking thing about him was the dark tattoo of a dragon on the side of his neck, which looked even bolder against his wet skin. He did not look like the rich, polite men inside the ballroom. He looked powerful and dangerous, like someone who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. He walked with a steady, calm pace that showed he was completely focused on the woman standing in the middle of the road. Amara watched him, her lips slightly parted in shock. She felt a mix of sadness and confusion as he stopped just a few feet away from her. Up close, his expression was quiet and intense, hiding a deep emotion that only she could see. He looked at her soaked burgundy gown and her wet, heavy curls with eyes that were full of care. Even though he was a feared man, he looked quietly vulnerable standing there in the rain with her. The wind blew hard, but Min-jae did not flinch. He stood like a rock in the storm, his calm presence pushing away the cold that had settled in Amara's bones. Behind them, the lights of the mansion glowed, but Min-jae did not even glance at the house or the family watching from the doorway. To him, the only person who mattered in the entire world was the girl his heart had chosen long ago. The silence between them was heavy with things they hadn't said yet, and for the first time that night, Amara didn't feel like she was standing alone. Lee Min-jae did not speak at first. He reached into the pocket of his soaked trousers and pulled out a small, dark leather box. His steady hand held it out toward Amara, and when he clicked it open, a diamond caught the light of the rain and the headlights, glowing like a tiny star. Amara raised her hand cautiously in front of her. Her lips parted in shock as she looked from the ring to the serious man standing in the storm with her. The jewelry was not just a gift. It was a statement that she was no longer the discarded daughter of a family that did not want her. "Your father said you are a stranger to his house," Min-jae said, his voice low and certain, carrying through the sound of the falling rain. "But he does not get to decide who you are. My house is your house. My name is your name." He stepped closer, his posture calm and deliberate, showing that he was emotionally committed to every word he spoke. He wasn't offering her a place to hide. He was offering her a kingdom where she would be the most powerful person in the room. Amara looked at the ring and then back at the mansion where her family stood like silhouettes in the doorway. They had stripped her of her name and her dignity, but in this moment, Min-jae was giving her a rank they could never take away. He was a man with a dangerous aura, a leader who controlled an entire world. Yet he was quietly vulnerable as he waited for her answer in the mud and the cold. He was telling her that she didn't need to beg for a seat at her father's table when she could have the throne beside him. Her sadness and hesitation began to turn into a strange new feeling of strength. She realized that the people inside the house had lost, and she was the one who had been found. As the rain continued to run down her face and soak her wine-colored gown, Amara looked into Min-jae's focused eyes. She saw a man who saw her fully, not as a prop or a burden, but as his queen. She didn't need the Bennett name anymore. She reached out toward the ring, ready to step into a new story where she was finally loved and respected for exactly who she was. Min-jae kept one hand firmly on Amara's shoulder, his warmth soaking through the heavy, wet velvet of her gown. He turned his eyes toward the mansion, where the Bennett family stood huddled in the bright light of the doorway. They looked like small, frightened ghosts watching from the safety of their dry hall. Min-jae did not yell or move quickly, but the way he stood made the entire family take a step back into the shadows. He walked forward until he reached the bottom of the stone steps, his white shirt sticking to his skin and the dragon tattoo on his neck looking dark and dangerous in the rain. Amara's father tried to straighten his tie, his face pale as he looked at the line of black SUVs and the serious man standing before him. "You made a mistake," Min-jae said, his voice quiet but as sharp as a blade. "You treated your own blood like a business deal that didn't matter. You threw away the only thing in this house that was truly valuable." Amara's father opened his mouth to argue, but his voice failed him when he saw the focused, cold look in Min-jae's eyes. The rest of the family stayed silent, their smirks from earlier replaced by looks of pure terror. They realized too late that the man they had heard about in whispers, the one who controlled the city's heart, was the man they had just offended. "From this moment," Min-jae continued, his posture steady and controlled, "your business and your legacy are no longer yours to manage. You wanted to protect your brand, but now your brand belongs to me. You are under my jurisdiction now. Every deal you make and every cent you earn will go through my hands first." He looked at each of them, from the siblings who had laughed to the parents who had turned their backs. The price for their cruelty was high, and they would be paying it for a very long time. They had kicked Amara out to save their status, but by doing so, they had handed their entire lives over to a man who would never forget how they had treated her. Min-jae didn't wait for them to answer. He simply turned his back on them, showing that they were no longer worth his words. He had already taken everything that mattered, and now he was going back to the only person he actually cared to protect. Min-jae walked Amara back to the middle SUV, his hand never leaving hers as the rain continued to wash away the last traces of the Bennett Gala. One of the drivers, dressed in a sharp suit, quickly opened the heavy rear door for them. Amara took a deep breath and stepped inside, the soft leather seat feeling warm and safe compared to the freezing storm outside. As she sat down, the weight of her soaked burgundy gown finally felt light, as if the burden of her old life had stayed on the wet stone path. Min-jae slid in beside her, and the door closed with a solid, quiet thud that shut out the world. For a moment, the only sound was the steady beat of the rain on the roof. Min-jae reached over and wrapped a thick, dry blanket around her shoulders. He didn't say a word, but his calm, focused eyes told her everything she needed to know. She wasn't a prop or a shadow anymore. She was the most important person in his universe. As the engine hummed to life, the lead SUV began to move forward. Amara leaned her head against the cool glass of the window and looked back one last time. In the small rearview mirror, she saw the Bennett mansion growing smaller and smaller. The bright lights of the ballroom looked like tiny, fading sparks in the dark. She saw her family still standing in the doorway, looking lost and small as they watched the fleet of black cars leave. She did not feel the sadness she expected. Instead, she felt a quiet sense of peace. The Bennett brand was a story she was no longer writing. She turned her head away from the mirror and looked at Min-jae, whose hand was still closed tightly around hers. The dragon tattoo on his neck caught the soft glow of the car's dashboard, a reminder of the powerful man who had chosen her when everyone else had walked away. The SUVs drove through the iron gates of the estate, and they didn't slow down. They were heading toward a new home and a new rank that Amara had finally earned. As the mansion disappeared into the shadows of the November night, Amara knew she was never going back. She had left as a discarded daughter, but she was riding away as a queen. The road ahead was long and dark, but for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she belonged.